In 1964, a blue Plymouth circled the Daytona International Speedway with such terrifying speed that it didn't just win the race, it broke the sport. Richard Petty crossed the finish line a full lap ahead of second place, and while the fans cheered, the executives at Ford and Chevrolet went pale. They weren't looking at a car, they were looking at an extinction event. Under the hood of that Plymouth was an engine so dominant, so technically superior, and so controversial that NASCAR would spend the next 7 years rewriting the rulebook just to stop it. This wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration of war. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about banned engines and the engineering wars that define the golden age of racing. If you're someone who loves the stories behind the horsepower, the secret development programs, and the cars that were too fast for their own good, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, to really understand why the 426 Hemi was such a catastrophe for the competition, we have to back up a bit. You might be thinking that Chrysler just woke up one day and decided to build a monster, but the reality is much more desperate. In the early 1960s, the mantra, "When on Sunday, sell on Monday," wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was the entire business model for Detroit. If your car won the Daytona 500, dealership traffic would spike by 15 to 20% the next morning. It was a direct pipeline from the podium to the profit margin. And in 1963, Chrysler was bleeding. Ford was crushing everyone with their massive 427 engines in the Galaxy. Chevrolet, officially out of racing but unofficially very much involved, had introduced the Mystery Motor, a Mark II big block that was shattering track records. Chrysler's existing engine, the 426 Max Wedge, was a good street engine, but on the high banks of Daytona, it was gasping for air. It couldn't breathe at high RPMs. The aerodynamics of the Plymouths were like pushing a brick through the wind, and the engines were blowing up trying to keep pace. Chrysler's president, Lynn Townsend, looked at the race results and gave a simple, terrifying order to his engineers. "I want to win. I don't care what it costs, just win." Here's the thing about engineering under pressure. It usually leads to one of two things: disaster or revolution. Tom Hoover, the father of the 426 Hemi, chose revolution. He was a physics nerd who happened to love drag racing, and he knew that the fundamental problem with the wedge engine was airflow. An engine is basically an air pump. The more air you can shove in and the faster you can get the exhaust out, the more power you make. The wedge engines had valves that were side by side, which limited how big those valves could be. It was a bottleneck. Hoover remembered the old Chrysler firepower engines from the 1950s, the first-generation Hemis. They were heavy and expensive, but that hemispherical combustion chamber design allowed the valves to be placed opposite each other. That meant you could put massive valves in the head, opening up the lungs of the engine. So Hoover and a small skunkworks team started a project that wasn't even officially on the books. They took the 426 block and decided to cast a new head with that old-school Hemi design. But they didn't just copy the 1950s design, they injected it with steroids. They pushed the intake valves to a massive 2.25 inches. They designed ports that looked like sewer pipes compared to the garden hoses on the Ford engines. When they put the first prototype on the dyno, it didn't just beat the target horsepower, it shattered the equipment. The engine was making over 550 horsepower in race trim right out of the box, while the competition was struggling to hit 500. Now, you might be thinking, okay, they built a big engine, so what? But here's what most people don't realize. The Hemi wasn't just powerful, it was durable. The block was reinforced with extra iron, the main caps were cross-bolted like a diesel engine for stability, and the crankshaft was forged steel. It was built to run at 7,000 RPM all day long without sweating. They called it the Elephant because it was huge, heavy, and absolutely unstoppable. But building it was one thing, getting it approved for NASCAR was another. NASCAR rules stated that an engine had to be a production engine. It had to be available to the public. Chrysler knew the Hemi was complex and expensive to build, too expensive for a regular family sedan. So they exploited a loophole. The rulebook said that the engine had to be available, but it didn't say it had to be common. They rushed the production, hand-building these engines to get them ready for the 1964 season opener. When the teams arrived at Daytona in February 1964, nobody knew what was coming. The Plymouths and Dodges looked the same as last year. The drivers, Richard Petty and Paul Goldsmith, were playing it cool, but the sound gave it away. The Hemi had a distinct, deep growl, a different firing order cadence that unsettled the Ford mechanics. During practice, the Chrysler drivers were sandbagging, lifting off the throttle on the back straights to hide their true speed. They wanted to lull Ford into a false sense of security. It worked. Right up until qualifying. Paul Goldsmith went out and laid down a lap of 174.9 miles per hour. The previous record was 160. It was a quantum leap. The Ford engineers accused the timing clocks of being broken. Then Richard Petty went out and matched the pace. The paddock went silent. It wasn't just one fast car. It was the entire Chrysler fleet. They were 10 to 15 miles per hour faster on the straights than the best Fords. It was a bloodbath before the green flag even dropped. This is where it gets really interesting. The race itself, the 1964 Daytona 500, is often remembered as a boring race because of how lopsided it was. But historically, it was the moment the sport changed forever. Richard Petty didn't just lead, he toyed with the field. He led 184 of the 200 laps. The Fords were blowing up trying to chase him. The Chevrolets were overheating. The Hemi cars swept the top 3 spots: Petty, Jimmy Pardue, and Goldsmith. When Petty took the checkered flag, he had time to wave to the crowd, cool down the car, and park it in victory lane before the second-place car even finished the final lap. The aftermath was immediate panic. Ford threatened to boycott. They went to NASCAR's president, Bill France Sr., and essentially said, "If you don't ban this thing, we're leaving." And Bill France was in a tough spot. He needed the manufacturer's money, but he also needed a show. A race where one guy wins by a full lap isn't a race, it's a parade. But he couldn't just ban it outright immediately because the engine technically met the rules. So, the 1964 season continued, and it was a massacre. The Hemi won everywhere. Super speedways, short tracks, road courses, it didn't matter. The torque curve was so flat that it pulled like a freight train from any RPM. Drivers joked that the only way to pass a Hemi was to wait for it to pit for gas. And that was the only weakness. It drank fuel like it was free, but even with extra pit stops, they were still faster. By the end of '64, the writing was on the wall. NASCAR couldn't let this continue. The uncertainty of outcome, the holy grail of sports entertainment, was gone. You knew a Hemi was going to win. The only question was, which one? So in late 1964, Bill France dropped the hammer. He announced new rules for 1965. He didn't say the Hemi is banned. That would be too direct. Instead, he changed the definition of a production engine. The new rule stated that a production engine couldn't just be available. It had to be installed in a certain number of street cars, and it couldn't be a special racing engine. It had to be a regular option. Since Chrysler hadn't put the Hemi in thousands of family sedans yet, the 426 was instantly illegal. This leads us to the most dramatic standoff in racing history. Most companies would have folded. They would have gone back to the drawing board, built a wedge engine, and tried to compete on NASCAR's terms. But Chrysler? They did something nobody expected. They called a press conference and said, "If we can't race the Hemi, we won't race at all." It was a total manufacturer boycott. For the 1965 Daytona 500, the track was silent of that Hemi growl. Richard Petty, the defending champion, the king, was sitting in the grandstands. The most famous driver in the sport was unemployed because his car was illegal. The fans were furious. They wanted to see the fastest cars, and the Hemi was the fastest. But NASCAR stood firm. They thought Chrysler would blink first. They were wrong. While NASCAR was running races with half-empty stands because the biggest stars were missing, Chrysler took the Hemi elsewhere. They went to the drag strips. They built lightweight, altered wheelbase cars that became the first funny cars. They put the Hemi in them and went on a national tour, breaking every drag racing record in existence. They were proving a point. Our engine is the best, and if NASCAR won't let us run, we'll find somewhere else to dominate. The year 1965 was a disaster for NASCAR. Without the Hemi, the races were predictable. Ford won 48 out of 55 races that season. It was a statistical massacre, but it was boring. Attendance dropped. Promoters were panicking. Fans were writing angry letters demanding to see the king back on track. Richard Petty was drag racing a Barracuda with 43 Junior painted on the side. And while it was cool, it wasn't Daytona.
Bill France Sr. was a stubborn man, but he was also a businessman. He realized that a war with Chrysler was a war he couldn't afford to win if it meant losing the fans. So behind closed doors, a deal was struck. NASCAR would allow the Hemi back for the 1966 season, but with one massive condition. It had to be installed in a production car available to the general public. Not a handful of specials, but a real street car that anyone could walk into a dealership and buy. This is where the legend of the street Hemi begins. You might be thinking, great, they just put the race engine in a street car. But it wasn't that simple. A full race 426 Hemi was a beast. It had massive compression, radical cam timing, and it idled like a tractor. It would overheat in traffic, foul spark plugs at stoplights, and was generally miserable to drive anywhere other than a racetrack. Chrysler engineers had to take this fire-breathing dragon and teach it some manners. They lowered the compression ratio from 12.5 to 1 to 10.25 to 1 so it could run on pump gas. They installed milder camshafts. They added heat risers to help with cold starts, but they kept the soul of the engine intact. It still had two massive 4-barrel carburetors. It still had those huge ports. It was rated at 425 horsepower, but everyone knew that was a lie. In reality, it was making closer to 500. When the 1966 Dodge Coronet and Plymouth Belvedere hit the showrooms with the Hemi option, the automotive press went insane. It was the most powerful engine ever offered in a mass-produced car. And just like that, the Hemi was legal again. Richard Petty was back. The fans returned. The 1966 Daytona 500 was set to be the rematch of the century. Ford had used their year of dominance to refine their 427 wedge engine, and they were confident. But the Hemi had spent a year getting stronger on the drag strip. When practice started for the '66 Daytona 500, something strange happened. The Hemis were fast, terrifyingly fast, but they were eating tires. The sheer torque and horsepower were shredding the rubber compounds of the day. Goodyear and Firestone were in a tire war of their own, trying to build a tire that could survive the Hemi's brutality. During the race, drivers were blowing tires left and right. It became a game of survival. Richard Petty, driving his famous Petty Blue Plymouth, managed to nurse his tires better than anyone else. He was the only one who could harness the power without destroying the car. Petty won the 1966 Daytona 500 a full 2 laps ahead of the field. The message was sent. The Hemi is back, and the rules didn't slow it down. It was a humiliation for Ford. They had spent millions developing their own engines, and they were still getting beaten by a design that was now 2 years old. But here's what most people don't realize about this era. It wasn't just Chrysler pushing the boundaries. Ford actually built an engine to kill the Hemi, and it's one of the greatest what-ifs in racing history. It was called the 426 SOCO, or the Cammer. It was an overhead cam V8 that revved like a chainsaw and made even more power than the Hemi. Ford showed up with it, ready to race, and NASCAR took one look at it and said, absolutely not. They banned it before it ever turned a lap in competition. Why? Because it was too exotic. It was too expensive. It threatened to turn stock car racing into a technological arms race that would bankrupt the smaller teams. So while the Hemi was allowed back because it was technically a production engine, the Ford Cammer was outlawed. This fueled the fire.
Ford felt targeted, Chrysler felt vindicated, and the rivalry intensified. With the engine dominance established, the team started looking for speed elsewhere. If everyone has a Hemi or a competitive 427 wedge, how do you go faster? You cheat the wind. This is where the story shifts from pure horsepower to aerodynamics. The 1966 and 67 seasons saw a new kind of warfare. The cars were boxy. They were bricks. At 175 miles per hour, the air becomes a solid wall. The Hemi had enough power to punch through it, but it was inefficient. Petty and the other Chrysler teams started noticing something. The rear end of the car was lifting at high speeds. The air was getting under the car and creating lift, which made the rear tires lose traction. It was dangerous. Drivers described it as driving on ice at 180 miles per hour. To fix this, they started modifying the bodies. They lowered the nose, they flushed the grills, they experimented with small spoilers on the trunk lid.
NASCAR, predictably, hated this. They wanted the cars to look stock. Every time a team showed up with a new aerodynamic trick, the inspectors would measure it, frown, and usually ban it. But the teams were clever. They would acid dip the bodies to make them lighter. They would chemically mill the sheet metal so it was paper thin. They were shaving ounces and reshaping fenders by millimeters. By 1967, Richard Petty was unstoppable. He won 27 races that season. 27, including a streak of 10 in a row. It is a record that will never be broken. The combination of the Hemi engine, the Petty Enterprises team, and Richard's driving talent was a perfect storm. It was the peak of the stock car era. But it was about to end. The 1968 season brought a new challenge. The tracks were getting faster, and the tires were still the limiting factor. But the real problem was that the cars were hitting an aerodynamic wall. You could add more horsepower, but the drag was increasing exponentially. To go 5 miles per hour faster required 50 more horsepower. To go 10 miles per hour faster might take 150. The Hemi was tapped out. It was already making as much power as was physically possible with the technology of the day. This is where the engineers realized they had to change the car itself, not just tweak it, but radically redesign it. Dodge introduced the Charger 500. It had a flush grille and a flush rear window to smooth out the airflow. It was better, but it wasn't enough. The Fords were still competitive on the superspeedways because their fastback Torinos cut through the air cleaner. So, in a wind tunnel in Detroit, a group of Chrysler rocket scientists, literally they worked on the missile program, looked at the Charger and asked, what if we ignore what a car is supposed to look like? They started taping cardboard cones to the front of the car. They built a massive wing on the back, not for style, but to generate actual downforce. They were building a spaceship. They created the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. It had a pointed nose cone that added 18 inches to the length of the car. It had a wing that stood 2 feet above the trunk lid so it could catch clean air above the roofline. It looked ridiculous. It looked like a cartoon. But when they took it to the track for testing, the numbers were impossible. The test driver, Buddy Baker, went out and casually broke 200 miles per hour. Nobody had ever gone 200 miles per hour on a closed course in a stock car. It was a barrier, like the sound barrier. And the Charger Daytona didn't just break it, it smashed it. The car was stable, it was planted, and it was powered by the 426 Hemi. Now, imagine NASCAR's reaction. They had just spent years trying to slow these cars down, and now Chrysler shows up with a winged warrior that makes the previous cars look like Model Ts. The other owners were furious. "That's not a stock car," they yelled. "You can't sell that." But Chrysler had learned their lesson from 1965. They knew the rules. The rulebook said they had to build 500 of them to make it legal. So they did. They built exactly 501 Dodge Charger Daytonas. They were expensive, ugly, and hard to park, and dealerships hated them. They sat on lots for months. But it didn't matter. They were legal. The 1969 season became the Aero Wars. Ford responded with the Torino Talladega, a sleek, long-nosed car of their own. It was an arms race of wind tunnels and horsepower. The Hemi was the heart of it, but the body was the weapon. Here's the thing about the Aero Wars. It was dangerous. The speeds were getting out of control. The tires couldn't handle 200-mile-per-hour loads in the corners. The suspension components were failing. NASCAR was watching this escalation with dread. They knew that if a car went into the stands at 200 miles per hour, the sport might be banned by the government. They had to do something. But the fans loved it. The winged cars were iconic. They were superheroes. And right in the middle of this high-speed chaos, Plymouth, the brand Richard Petty drove, decided they wanted a winged car too. They built the Superbird. It was even more refined than the Daytona. It was the ultimate evolution of the stock car, and with the 426 Hemi under the hood, it was the most dominant machine ever built for oval racing. Now, you might be thinking that Richard Petty, the king of NASCAR and the face of Plymouth, was leading the charge in this new winged car. But here is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. In 1969, Richard Petty actually left Plymouth. It was the biggest betrayal in racing history. He walked into the Plymouth executive's office and said, "I want a winged car like the Dodge Daytona." And the executives, in their infinite corporate wisdom, said, "No, the winged car is for Dodge. You drive a Plymouth. Plymouths don't have wings." So Richard Petty did the unthinkable. He walked across the street to Ford. For the 1969 season, the king of NASCAR drove a blue Ford Torino Talladega. It was like seeing Michael Jordan in a Knicks jersey. It felt wrong. The fans hated it. Plymouth sales plummeted. The executives realized they had made a colossal mistake. They had let their golden goose walk away over a piece of sheet metal.
Panic set in at Plymouth. They needed Petty back, so they greenlit the Superbird project immediately. They took the Roadrunner, slapped a nose cone on it that was slightly different from the Dodge's to fix an overheating issue, and built a rear wing that was even more aggressive. The sole purpose of the Plymouth Superbird was to lure Richard Petty back home. And it worked. When they showed him the blueprints, he signed the contract. In 1970, the king was back in a Plymouth, and he had his wings. The 1970 season was the peak of insanity. You had the Plymouth Superbirds and Dodge Daytonas powered by 426 Hemis going up against the Ford Torino Talladegas and Mercury Cyclone spoilers powered by the Ford Boss 429. It was a heavyweight fight at 200 miles per hour. The cars were so fast that the tracks couldn't contain them. At Talladega Superspeedway, they were hitting speeds that the tire technology simply couldn't handle. Tires were disintegrating after just a few laps. Drivers were terrified. The Drivers Association, led by Petty, even threatened to boycott the first race at Talladega because the track was too rough for the speeds they were hitting. But the racing? It was incredible. The Aero cars could draft like nothing else. They could slice through the air and slingshot past each other. The Hemi was screaming at 7,200 RPM for 500 miles. It was a testament to American engineering excess. But it was also the beginning of the end. NASCAR's president, Bill France Jr., taking over more duties from his father, looked at this and saw a nightmare. The speeds were dangerous. The insurance companies were getting nervous. But more importantly, the stock car connection was broken. A Superbird didn't look like anything a normal person drove to work. It looked like a spaceship. The manufacturers were spending millions on wind tunnels and exotic parts that had zero relevance to street cars. The win on Sunday, sell on Monday model was breaking down because people couldn't buy these cars or didn't want to. The dealerships were still struggling to sell the homologation specials because they were impractical nightmares to park at the grocery store. So for the 1971 season, NASCAR decided to kill the monster they had helped create. They didn't just ban the Hemi this time, they strangled it with math.
The new rule was simple but devastating. You could race a winged car, or you could race a big engine over 305 cubic inches, basically a small block Chevy or Ford. If you wanted to run the big 426 Hemi or the Ford 429, you had to run a standard body with the aerodynamics of a brick. It was a brilliant, if cruel, piece of rulemaking. It gave the teams a choice, but it wasn't really a choice. A 305 cubic inch engine in a heavy Superbird would be hopelessly slow off the corners. A 426 Hemi in a standard body would be fast in a straight line, but unstable in the turns. The math didn't work. The advantage of the wing was aerodynamic efficiency at high speed, but without the big engine's torque to get you there, it was useless, and the big engine without the wing just burned tires. Chrysler did the math. They realized the era of the Aero Warriors was over. They parked the Superbirds and Daytonas. They went back to the standard bodies, the Roadrunners and Chargers. But even then, the writing was on the wall for the Hemi itself. See, 1971 wasn't just a turning point for NASCAR, it was a turning point for the entire automotive industry. The Clean Air Act had passed in 1970. The EPA was cracking down on emissions, the insurance companies were raising rates on muscle cars to astronomical levels. The days of 425 horsepower street engines were numbered. Chrysler, under pressure from the government and their own accountants, began to defund their racing programs. The Hemi was an expensive engine to build. It required hand finishing. It required premium fuel. In a world that was starting to worry about gas mileage and smog, the Hemi was a dinosaur. A magnificent, fire-breathing dinosaur, but a dinosaur. Nonetheless, NASCAR sensed this shift. They wanted to move the sport toward smaller, more modern cars, the kind people were actually buying. They wanted to attract new manufacturers like Buick and Oldsmobile, who didn't have dedicated race engines. To do that, they had to level the playing field again. In 1971, NASCAR introduced a restrictor plate rule specifically for the Hemi on superspeedways. A restrictor plate is a metal plate with 4 holes in it that goes between the carburetor and the intake manifold. It restricts the amount of air the engine can suck in. Remember what we said earlier, an engine is an air pump. If you choke the air supply, you kill the power. The 426 Hemi, an engine designed specifically for massive airflow, was suffocated. The teams tried to tune around it, but you can't tune around physics. The Fords and Chevrolets with their wedge designs were less affected by the plates because they weren't relying as heavily on massive port volume. The Hemi lost its edge. Richard Petty, ever the pragmatist, saw the writing on the wall. He ran the Hemi for the 1971 season, winning the championship one last time in a standard body Plymouth Roadrunner. It was the Hemi's swan song, a final up yours to the rulebook. He won 21 races that year, proving that even handicapped, the King and his Hemi were a force of nature. But by 1972, the big block era was officially dead. NASCAR implemented a new rule. Maximum engine displacement was set at 358 cubic inches. The 426 Hemi, the Ford 249, the Chevy 427, they were all illegal. Overnight, the greatest engines in American history were banished from the sport they defined. This is where it gets really interesting for collectors today. Because the Hemi was banned so effectively, and because Chrysler pulled out of racing shortly after, the development stopped. The engine was frozen in time. It became a legend not because it faded away, but because it was executed at its peak. The team sold off their Hemi parts. They went into barns, garages, and drag racer shops. The cars were stripped. Many Superbirds were converted back to regular Roadrunners just to sell them off used car lots. Imagine that, taking a car worth $500,000 today and ripping the nose off it just to sell it for $800 in 1972. It happened. The Hemi's exile from NASCAR drove it into other forms of motorsport, where rules were looser. Drag racing embraced it. The NHRA didn't care about stock appearance. They cared about speed. The Hemi found a new home in Top Fuel and Funny Car, where it evolved into the nitro-burning monsters we see today. In a way, NASCAR banning the Hemi saved it. If it had stayed in NASCAR, it would have been slowly neutered, restricted, and modified until it was just another engine. By banning it, NASCAR preserved its myth. But the story doesn't end in 1972. There is a fascinating postscript to the Hemi saga that involves a secret program, a forgotten car, and the final attempt to cheat the system one last time. In the mid-1970s, Petty Enterprises was struggling. The new small block engines didn't suit their style. They missed the torque. So they started looking for loopholes again. They found a rule that allowed obsolete engines to be run in certain lower-tier divisions. They built a kit car, a Dodge Dart with a Hemi stuffed into it, just to see if they could get away with it at local tracks. It was a monster. It destroyed the competition at short tracks across the South. NASCAR quickly stepped in and clarified the rules. No Hemis, period, anywhere. Look, when NASCAR slammed the door on the Hemi, the engine didn't just retire to a museum. It kicked open a window and jumped into a completely different world. This is where the story shifts from oval tracks to the quarter mile. And honestly, this might be where the Hemi truly earned its immortality. You might be thinking, okay, so it was banned from turning left, big deal. But here's the thing. Very design features that made the Hemi unfair in NASCAR, those massive ports, the breathing capability, the cross-bolted mains, were the exact ingredients needed for something far more extreme: top fuel drag racing. In the 1970s, drag racing was undergoing its own revolution. They were experimenting with exotic fuels like nitromethane. Nitromethane isn't just gas, it's a liquid explosive. It carries its own oxygen, so you can burn massive amounts of it. But to burn that much fuel, you need an engine that can flow air like a wind tunnel. The standard wedge engines from Ford and Chevy simply couldn't handle the volume. They would hydraulic. Basically, the cylinder would fill with liquid fuel because it couldn't compress it, and the head would blow off. The Hemi, with its massive combustion chambers and cavernous ports, was different. It could swallow that fuel mixture and survive. Don Garlits, the big daddy of drag racing, realized this early on. He took the 426 Hemi, supercharged it, and started feeding it nitro. The result was violence. Controlled violence. The engine that was making 550 horsepower in NASCAR was suddenly making 2,000, then 3,000, then 5,000 horsepower. Here's a stat that will blow your mind. Today, every single top fuel dragster and funny car, the ones that do 330 miles per hour in under 4 seconds, runs a version of the Chrysler 426 Hemi. They are machined from billet aluminum now, and they make over 11,000 horsepower. But the geometry, the valve angles, the bore spacing, it is exactly the same as the engine Richard Petty used to win the 1964 Daytona 500. NASCAR banned it for being too good, and in doing so, they accidentally created the standard for the fastest accelerating vehicles on Earth. But while the Hemi was conquering the drag strip, something strange was happening on the streets. Remember those homologation specials we talked about? The cars Chrysler had to build to make the engine legal for NASCAR? The Plymouth Superbirds, the Dodge Daytonas, the Hemi Cudas. In the early 1970s, nobody wanted them. This is where it gets really interesting for anyone who likes money. In 1971, you could walk into a dealership and buy a Hemi Cuda convertible. It was the last year for the Hemi. The insurance was high, gas was expensive, and the car was a handful to drive. Chrysler only built a handful of them, specifically 11 for the 1971 model year. They sat on lots. Dealers were practically giving them away just to get them off the books. Fast forward to today. One of those 1971 Hemi Cuda convertibles sold at auction for $3.5 million. Why? Because they are the artifacts of a war that Chrysler lost. They are the physical proof of the lengths a company went to just to win a trophy. If NASCAR hadn't forced Chrysler to build them, they wouldn't exist. The rarity wasn't a marketing ploy. It was a failure of sales caused by a rulebook requirement. And that brings us to the lost years. From 1972 until the early 2000s, the Hemi was a ghost. You couldn't buy one in a new car. The name itself became a shibboleth for car guys. If you whispered Hemi at a car show, heads turned. It was the forbidden fruit. Dodge and Plymouth struggled during this time. They built K-cars. They built minivans. They saved the company from bankruptcy, sure, but the soul was missing. The Mopar faithful were living in the past, rewatching old tapes of Petty and reading old magazines about the Daytona 500 dominance. The brand had lost its edge because it had lost its monster. Then in in 2003, something unexpected happened. Chrysler brought the name back. They introduced a 5.7-liter Hemi V8 in the Dodge Ram pickup. Now, let's be real for a second. Is the modern Hemi actually a Hemi? Technically, sort of. The combustion chambers aren't perfectly hemispherical like the 426. They're more complex, designed for emissions and efficiency. But the marketing? Genius. They didn't sell the engine on its specs. They sold it on its legacy. The commercials, "That thing got a Hemi," tapped directly into the cultural memory of the 1960s bands. They were telling the public, we are the crazy ones. We're the ones who built the engine that was too fast for NASCAR. And it worked. A whole new generation of kids who weren't even born when Richard Petty was banned suddenly wanted a Dodge because it had a Hemi.
This revival culminated in 2015 with the Hellcat, when Dodge dropped a 707-horsepower supercharged engine into a street car. The world lost its mind. But if you look at the engineering philosophy, it is the exact same playbook as 1964. Overkill is underrated. The Hellcat engine is a spiritual successor to the 426 race Hemi. It wasn't built to be practical. It wasn't built to be efficient. It was built to dominate the conversation. And just like in 1964, the competition didn't know how to react. Ford and Chevy were building track cars. Dodge built a drag strip bully. But let's go back to Richard Petty for a minute, because his post-Hemi career is a fascinating case study in adaptation. After 1971, the King had to reinvent himself. He won championships in 1972, 74, 75, and 79, driving cars with small block engines, 358 cubic inches, restrictor plates, standard bodies. He proved he wasn't just a product of the Hemi. He was a great driver. However, if you look at the stats, his absolute dominance, the lapping the field kind of dominance, ended when the Hemi was banned. The races became closer. The margins of victory went from laps to seconds to inches. This was exactly what NASCAR wanted. They wanted the show. They wanted the photo finish. They manufactured parity by outlawing excellence. And this brings up a massive what if. What if NASCAR had never banned the Hemi? What if they had said, okay, Ford, catch up. Chevy, figure it out. We might have seen overhead cam engines in the 1970s. We might have seen fuel injection 10 years earlier. We might have seen speeds hit 230 miles per hour at Daytona in 1975. But we also might have seen the sport collapse. The cost to compete would have been astronomical. The small teams, the Wood brothers, the privateers, would have been priced out. NASCAR might have become Formula One, a technological parade with no passing. So in a weird way, Bill France was right. He saved the sport by killing its greatest invention. He sacrificed the integrity of stock car racing to preserve the entertainment value. It's a bitter pill to swallow for engineering purists, but it's the reason NASCAR became a multi-billion-dollar industry in the 90s instead of a niche hobby. There is another layer to this story that often gets overlooked. The ban on the Hemi didn't just affect the cars, it affected the drivers. We talked about Petty, but what about the guys who couldn't adapt? What about the drivers who relied on that raw horsepower to mask handling issues? When the Hemi went away, a lot of careers faded with it. The new era required finesse. It required drafting skills. It required managing tire wear on a car that didn't have infinite power to correct a mistake. The 1970s became the era of the drafter. David Pearson, Cale Yarborough, Bobby Allison. These guys learned to use the air in ways that the Hemi drivers never had to. They couldn't just smash the gas and drive away. They had to play chess at 190 miles per hour. The banning of the Ultimate engine actually elevated the skill level of the drivers. It forced them to find speed in the chassis, in the suspension, and in their own hands. So when you look at a modern NASCAR race, with the cars running door to door, restrictor plates choking the engines, and everyone complaining about the package, remember that this entire format exists because of what happened in 1964. The very structure of modern stock car racing is a scar left by the Hemi.
Every restrictor plate, every gear rule, every spoiler dimension is a direct descendant of the panic caused by Richard Petty lapping the field. You might look at the modern NASCAR next-gen car and see a spec racer. The bodies are composite, the chassis are identical, and the engines are tightly regulated. It seems like the complete opposite of the Hemi era. But if you look closer, the spirit of 1964 is still there. Every time a team gets caught with a modified spoiler or a roof rail that is a millimeter too wide, or an intake manifold that has been massaged, it is the ghost of the 426 Hemi. The teams are still trying to break the sport, and NASCAR is still trying to save it. The difference is that in 1964, the unfair advantage was a 426 cubic inch sledgehammer. Today, it is a laptop program or a wind tunnel simulation. But the game is the same. Find the line, step over it, and see if anyone notices. The Hemi just did it so loudly that everyone noticed. And this brings us to the real reason we are still talking about an engine that hasn't raced in NASCAR for 50 years. We love the Outlaw. We love the idea that someone was so good, so smart, and so powerful that the only way to beat them was to change the rules. It validates our belief that excellence is dangerous. It makes engineering feel like a superpower. Think about it. If the Hemi had just been a pretty good engine that won a few championships and then faded away, it would be a footnote. It would be remembered like the Hudson Hornet or the Oldsmobile Rocket 88, respected but not mythical. By banning it, NASCAR turned it into a martyr. They gave it a story that transcends racing. It became the engine that the man tried to kill. Today, if you go to a car auction, you will see rows of beautiful Ferraris, Porsches, and Corvettes. They are fast, they are expensive, and they are impressive. But then you will see a 1970 Plymouth Superbird with a 426 Hemi. It looks like a brick with a wing. The interior is cheap vinyl. The build quality is questionable, but it will sell for more than the Ferrari. Why? Because the Ferrari is just a car. The Superbird is a weapon. It is a physical piece of the war between Richard Petty and Bill France. It is a monument to the time when American engineers looked at the laws of physics and the NASCAR rulebook and decided to beat both of them. The 426 Hemi is the ultimate proof that in racing, and maybe in life, it is better to be banned than to be forgotten. It is better to be so dominant that you force the world to change around you than to simply fit in. So the next time you hear that deep, distinctive idle of a classic Mopar muscle car, that lope, lope, lope that sounds like the engine is angry at the ground, remember what you are listening to. You aren't just hearing combustion. You are hearing the sound of panic in the Ford boardrooms. You are hearing the frustration of NASCAR officials in 1964. You are hearing the sound of Richard Petty lapping the field at Daytona, one arm out the window, wondering where everybody else went. That is the legacy of the 426 Hemi. It wasn't just an engine, it was an event. It was the moment stock car racing grew up, got scary, and became the spectacle it is today. And even though it's been gone for half a century, in the hearts of gearheads and speed freaks everywhere, the elephant is still the king of the jungle. Thanks for watching Legacy Motoring. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the banned history of NASCAR, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more stories about illegal cars, secret prototypes, and the engineering wars that define the sport coming up. Let me know in the comments. Do you think NASCAR was right to ban the Hemi to save the show, or should they have let Chrysler run wild? I read every comment, and I want to know what you think. Until next time, keep it fast and keep it loud.